mitigate the government's response to the coronavirus. We devote the programme to assessing that strategy. Public health experts, politicians, epidemiologists, and this man from Hong Kong on his way back from the World Health Organization, one of the world's leading coronavirus experts. We assess the strength of the global threat on the day more people have been diagnosed with the virus beyond China's borders, where there's large-scale quarantine, than within. Good evening. The virus is on the move. In France, there was the country's first death today, the first case in North Macedonia, and in Norway, and in the authorities in Greece, Austria, Croatia, Spain, Switzerland and Algeria are all dealing with victims who had been to Italy. In Italy itself, there are now 400 confirmed cases and 12 deaths. Germany says it's on the cusp of an epidemic. There are 59 confirmed cases in the US, 20 suspected cases in Brazil, and 2 announced in Pakistan. Among the change plans as a result of the threat, the Six Nations rugby fixture between Ireland and Italy has now been postponed. And in London, an office in Canary Wharf and another in central London sent staff home following fears that an employee was displaying symptoms, something that may well happen more often. Our global health correspondent, Tulip Mazumdar, is here. First of all, Tulip, do we have a clear idea now of what we're actually dealing with?
We do and we don't. This is still a relatively new virus. It was only discovered earlier this year. It was only identified as this new coronavirus earlier this year. There's still a lot we don't know about it, although scientists are finding out more every single day. We don't know, for example, where it came from. It made a jump from animals to humans, we think, but which animal, when, how did that happen? All those things are unknown. What we do know, though, is that this is a massive outbreak. More than 80,000 cases across 37 countries at least, and that number is going up all the time.
Now, words like pandemic are bandied about. Is it actually a pandemic?
Depends a little bit on who you ask. There are some scientists I've spoken to that have said that we are already in the early stages of a pandemic. The World Health Organization has very explicitly said, no, we are not. We are still in containment mode. But they say that a pandemic is an absolute possibility at this stage, but we're not there yet.
But when we think of pandemics and we look back to history, we think of Spanish flu, which at the very minimum killed 20 million people, but we're in a different situation. We're in a different century.
Exactly. 100 years on, a lot has changed since then. I mean, in some ways, it's more difficult because we travel so much more. Everybody can go all around the world very quickly, very easily. But on the other hand, there are lots of things in place. I mean, clearly science has advanced a great deal. We can develop diagnostics and vaccines much quicker. And we are able to work together as a team. All the countries around the world are able to alert each other much more quickly. And so things can be contained much more quickly.
And we're going to talk about the global response later on the programme. But as to a vaccine, we don't have a vaccine yet. There is no cure either.
No. We don't have a vaccine and we don't have a cure, although there are a number of antivirals that are used for the things like HIV that are being tested at the moment. In terms of a vaccine, we are a while away from that. We think that the earliest human trials might start in sort of spring, summertime. We're not expecting to have a workable vaccine that's for wider use until the end of the year, maybe early next year.
Tulip, you're going to join us later. Thanks very much indeed. Well, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, today outlined the government response to the coronavirus, including enhanced monitoring at airports and ports, designated hospitals ready for mass testing, guidance for schools and employers, and the rollout of a public information campaign. In Scotland, the Chief Medical Officer said it was highly likely there would be a positive case, and the Scottish Government has established 2 testing labs in Edinburgh and Glasgow. But with the country in a state of limbo, the government cannot provide cast iron assurances, but it can ready us for an outbreak. So has it? Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall.
Day by day, it feels like coronavirus is closing in. As its reach extends throughout Europe, the English Channel has rarely felt so narrow. Today, nervous MPs brought the Health Secretary before the Commons.
Secretary of State Matt Hancock.
We have a clear four-part plan to respond to the outbreak of this disease: contain, delay, research and mitigate. We're taking all necessary measures to minimise the risks to the public.
Some say the government has been disengaged, but however many cobras are convened, there are limits to today's politicians' power. The British state has already been preparing for this for years.
At the moment, thousands of tests are being rolled out for suspected cases. Over 7,000 people have been tested. Only 13 have been tested positively. But public information and advice has already gone out to all of those who might need to have it, to schools, to employers, to first responders, and to anybody who might come into contact with someone who might be suspected of having coronavirus, so that everybody can be ready should we reach the stage where we do need to go from the current point where we're in containment and detection mode to the treat and escalation mode, which is the next phase.
How the government will respond in that escalation mode is laid out in NHS England's Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response Framework, the document which sets out the expectations of each part of the health service in case of a major incident. A pandemic would be classified as Alert Level 4, the most serious, where NHS England may take control of all NHS resources across the country, i.e. centralised control of all NHS trusts. In practice, this might mean the establishment of swab squads to test people at home, political agreement for the postponement of hospital admissions to free up intensive care beds, and the cancellation of non-urgent operations, perhaps on a scale we haven't yet seen. Right now, the government wants to try and ensure that the escalation is delayed for as long as possible.
Some of the things the NHS does to cope with a normal winter are the same sorts of things that you see people do in the context of planning for an influenza outbreak. So, for example, if a hospital comes under pressure, it will consider whether it needs to stop delivering some of its normal services temporarily. And every winter, we see the NHS for a period of time stop doing planned surgery.
The problem is, there's probably not much the government can do to delay it for too long. The government's 2011 influenza strategy made clear that if containment fails, even drastic measures won't work, saying even a 99.9% travel restriction might delay a pandemic wave by only 2 months. Britain has dealt with something like this before, albeit on a less profound scale, with the 2009 swine flu outbreak. But swine flu was less infectious than COVID-19, more easily contained. But the differences aren't just virological. Crucially, they're political too. The NHS, the public realm in general, was a very different place back in 2009. Waiting lists were much shorter, financial pressures on the system much slighter. At the time, relatively few operations were even cancelled. Today, the slack in the system, its ability to deal with a major crisis, is much reduced. The new government is suddenly nervous. It has looked so imperial, so powerful, but for the first time in its short life, it is about to confront something it can shape, but cannot control.
And Lewis is here now. Lewis, more developments tonight.
Yes, indeed, Kirsty. I understand that the Cabinet Office today, as part of the preparations that the government is making for coronavirus, has been in touch and communicating with local authorities, specifically with regard to what they would call mass death preparedness. That sounds obviously rather gloomy and scary. It is at the upper end of where things might go, but it's specifically with relation to excess death contingency planning, and basically in communication with them as to what they might need to do in the event that this outbreak is at the upper end of where it might be. That includes things like, for example, mass graves and mass burial sites. And that obviously sounds very, very scary. And the government and Whitehall sources are very keen to point out that this has been done before. It doesn't happen very often, but it has happened in the past. For example, in the 2009 swine flu outbreak, as I was mentioning in my report there. But it is a sign of how serious the government is taking this. Rightly, many would say. They have given us a statement tonight where they've told us, we've been clear from the outset that we expect coronavirus to have some impact on the UK, which is why we are planning for every eventuality, including the reasonable worst-case scenario. Crucially, this does not mean we expect it to happen. Public safety is our top priority, and while there are currently only 13 confirmed cases in England, we have a team of public health experts and scientists working around the clock to make sure the NHS and UK more widely is fully prepared.
Thank you very much. Well, joining me now is Professor Gabriel Leung. He played a crucial role in research into the SARS crisis and is one of Asia's leading epidemiologists. He regularly advises national and international agencies, including the World Health Organization. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. First of all, before we go over some of the behaviours, you're on your way back from the WHO. And what is the latest thinking from the WHO on this?
I'm actually on my way from the WHO mission in China, actually. So as the mission head, Dr. Bruce Elwood, has said over the last 48 hours, the mission found new insights in terms of what the rest of the world can hopefully learn from and understand from the Chinese response, which, of course, is now reached a turning point in that China has reported fewer cases today for the first time than the rest of the world, and it appears that this virus is now spreading outside of China, perhaps quicker.
So are you surprised at the behaviour of the outbreak at all?
In terms of it spreading so quickly?
Yeah.
Not really, given what we already know about the epidemiology. So this particular bug is very different from SARS. It spreads much quicker, and it also appears that there is the potential that people spread when they are still incubating the disease, whereas SARS would only really infect others when you are spiking a high fever.
So, in fact, that makes it much more insidious because, of course, people are not necessarily aware that they are spreading.
Indeed.
So, what do you think about the coordination of the response so far? I mean, do you think we are learning from each other fast enough?
I think that we're learning from each other, most certainly. So as you can see, China had the lockdown of Wuhan and surrounding cities. Italy has locked down some of their villages and towns already. And you can see the population behavior and responses really sort of trying to mirror each other.
But we are, as we were talking earlier with Tulip, we're in a different century. People travel all the time. There's a much more movement. I mean, I have to ask you, I think you've said in the worst case scenario, 2/3 of the world's population could become infected. You did say that, didn't you?
I didn't actually say it. I was responding when I was asked by a newspaper. Some people in Japan have worked out a model and said it could spread to 60 to 80%.
Do you believe it?
I said it is plausible if there are no control measures. Secondly, it's really meaningless to say how many people are going to get it unless you know how severe it is.
Yeah.
And three, it depends on how long you give it.
Yeah.
If you look in terms of months and years ahead, of course, a lot of us, unless there is a vaccine, will eventually get it. But the whole point of epidemic control is you really flatten the peak, and then so that society and hospitals don't get overwhelmed.
Well, and we're going to unpick a lot of that during the programme. Thank you very much for now, Professor Leung. Well, right now we're going to speak to somebody who's dealing with this at first hand. There are UK citizens already quarantined or at least in lockdown in the Canary Islands after a visiting Italian doctor at a hotel in Tenerife tested positive for the violence. Guests at the Costa Ageshi Palace, which has 467 bedrooms, were then confined to the hotel where they are being kept tonight and may be indeed for the next 2 weeks. The hotel has been guarded by police in face masks. One of the estimated 160 Britons is Selina Lund, who is there with her husband and 2 children, and she joins us now from her hotel room. Good evening. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Selina. Can you give me a sense of what's been happening today, what's been happening tonight for your family?
Not a lot, really. We're not told anything. We were told this lunchtime, we went to reception because our keys had stopped working because we should have checked out yesterday and it stopped working. So we went there and they told us to go for lunch today down to the dining room. So we actually walked for the first time through the hotel to the dining room. but we actually were horrified, so we came back again.
Why were you horrified?
Because there was just so many people there. We went actually first at 1 o'clock like they told us to, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of people queuing up to go and get some food, and it just was claustrophobic, and I really felt uncomfortable about it, especially when we'd only been there that one night on Monday.
Can you explain to me, because I understand police outside are wearing masks, that you have security surrounding the hotel, but I understand that some people are not wearing masks in the hotel and others are. I mean, is there no guidance for people?
Exactly that, and that's what absolutely horrified us. We went down an hour later. When they were queuing, most people had masks on. There were some without, but most did. But when we actually went into the restaurant an hour later, once it had calmed down, we actually went to go get a plate, and the first person we saw was an elderly lady. She'd actually got a gash on her arm, and a mask was actually coming off her face. And she coughed, and I just said to my husband, we need to get out of here. I cannot eat in here.
But who's looking after you? Are the Spanish authorities looking after you? Are you in touch with the Foreign Office?
Well, this is another thing. So I went upstairs then, and I went. There's a desk in reception which has got the health officials there, and I was absolutely. Well, my daughter was so upset. She's 12 years old, and she was horrified at this elderly lady not having a mask on and coughing, which quite. Was right to do that.
I just want to check something with you. Is there any sense of any information about when you're getting tested, when you're getting released from the hotel?
Okay, so the doctors visited us yesterday and took everybody's temperature, and they provided every room with a thermometer. And we have to record at certain times a day what our temperature is. And then they phone up from outside, the medical team phone up and ask for those readings, which we give them. And providing they don't go above 37 degrees, we're okay. And then they said after that phone call that we could go around the hotel as long as we had sanitised our hands and we had covered our face up. But people aren't doing that, especially when they're going to eat. You know, they get there, they've probably got them on when they get there, but as soon as they start eating, they take them off, then they're going back up to the buffet again. And I thought, I cannot be in that situation, because for me, it's just a breeding ground.
Sarah, thank you for joining us, and we will be in touch with you again to find out how you're progressing. Thank you very much indeed. Well, to discuss this further, the full panel for tonight's show, along with Professor Leung, is joined now by Professor Paul Hunter, lead researcher of the National Institute of Health for Research and Unit into Emergency Preparedness and Response, a collaboration of UK universities and Public Health England, Steve Bryan, Conservative MP and Health Minister until last year, and Philippa Whitford, the SNP's Westminster spokesman on health and a doctor herself. We asked the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, or indeed any of his team, to take part tonight, but they declined. Thank you all very much for joining us. First of all, Ponta, when you hear the story, the convoluted mess that's in the hotel, what do you think?
Well, I think, and we saw this as well with the Diamond Princess, you know, I think the evidence was that the Diamond Princess did achieve its objectives in stopping the infection spreading globally. But if you're going to do that, you have to protect the people under quarantine, and you have to protect the staff. And I think what we've heard there would suggest that actually the authorities' responsibility to the people that are being quarantined isn't being fully and appropriately undertaken.
So what would you expect to be happening at a place where there's 467 bedrooms, it's full, there's people displaying completely different behaviours? What should happen?
Well, I think if we're going to stop spread within the hotel, people need to be stay in their rooms as much as possible. They need to have their catering brought up to the room. The concept of actually eating around tables where people are coughing is really a way that can spread quite actively amongst the residents of the hotel. And that just appears not to be happening.
Now, of course, we had news today from Matt Hancock about the government's preparedness, all the things, the four responses we were talking about earlier. But Steve Bryan, as a former health minister, do you think we're soon going to have to do more?
Yeah, I am worried, and I said a couple of weeks ago on the media that I thought this was going to get worse before it gets better, and it is consistent with what we've seen before, is that you go in peaks and troughs, and we went into a bit of a dip when it seemed to go a bit quieter, and there was lots of other news around, and people thought, oh, maybe we're past this, but now it's back with a vengeance. And just listening to Mrs. Lunn there, you know, you could sense the sheer anxiety and terror that she's
people feel
got
very
there.
vulnerable.
They feel very vulnerable. But I was thinking today, you know, the former public health minister, you know, if I was still in office today, would I be doing the same strategy that the government and Matt Hancock's doing? And I think I would, because ultimately there will be three things that would have been at the forefront of my mind. You've got to make sure that the public have decent information so that there's not panic and they're able to be responsible citizens. You've got to make sure that the media are informed so that they're not sensationalising and they're covering it responsibly. And then you've got to make sure that, dare I say, ministers resist the temptation to grandstand and try and overplay their hand. And actually, I think, as the Health Secretary said in the House today, I think all those three things have happened thus far. So I think it has been a competent and measured response so far.
Might we need to do further quarantining? When you look at what China was doing, do you think we may be in a situation where we have to extend quarantining?
We might, and if you look at the preparedness document that you saw in Lewis's report, you can see that the powers are there and the measures are there. Talking to Public Health England officials today that I used to work with, there's no question that they are ready to move. And
to quarantine a town if necessary.
And Matt has made it very clear that he will do what is necessary to protect the public. But let's be clear, we're being led by the science and led by the evidence, and we're nowhere near that right now, Kirsty.
As a doctor, what are your concerns about the messaging, about what people should do? We had tonight in London 2 companies where somebody seems to be displaying flu-like symptoms, but taking it upon themselves to send their employees home. Are we going to see more of that?
Well, I think there is confusion, and I think it's understandable. You know, if you were coming from Wuhan or Hubei, you had to self-isolate regardless of whether you had symptoms or not. But now we're now in a position of that for Italy. But yet we didn't have that for China. And yet we know how people were moving. We know Wuhan is a huge interchange. I mean, people were coming for Chinese New Year, moving off. And to me, at the moment, when the health secretary was talking about containment, containment only works if you're actually ahead of the game, and therefore you're containing it. And my worry is we don't know what the prodromal phase is. We don't know how long the incubation. As you were saying, Gabriel, you know, it looks as if people can spread this without being symptomatic. And that actually just makes it a lot harder to deal with.
Let me bring in Paul here about the whole idea of a Public Health England response and so forth, that you've got a situation where hospitals are designated. The knock-on impact, presumably there's 2 things, the knock-on impact to the NHS of having designated hospitals, but also the kind of people that we're quarantining, being ahead of the curve, presumably we have to quarantine vulnerable people from care homes who might be poorly, or people going through cancer treatment, for example, whose immune system is vulnerable.
Yes, I mean, and that's sort of protective quarantining for the people involved, and that will certainly be part of the next stage of the epidemic.
So we are going to see that happening?
Almost certainly, yes. I think at the moment the concept is around keeping people who are infected away from the rest of us. As soon as the disease starts spreading more widely in the population, we'll need to look at actually keeping the susceptible, the vulnerable people away from the rest of the population. So it's same quarantine, but it's a different objective.
And of course, you know, we have aging populations. You know, we have a lot of people who will be feeling very physically vulnerable. Is that that probably will be the next stage, that they'll be quarantining, as it were, for the well, as opposed to the people with the virus? It's just that they are vulnerable people.
I think that there are 2 things one needs to watch out for. One is make sure your health systems are not overwhelmed by
but
the
at the
sick,
moment, the NHS is overwhelmed anyway.
By the sick, and your surge capacity can cope. So the whole point to flatten the peak is to spread it out so that you will not, at any one single point in time, overwhelm your hospitals. And two,
excuse me, I mean, you probably know quite a lot about our NHS, but our NHS, our trolley times are bad just now. We are pretty to capacity. What is this going to do? Is this going to make our NHS quite vulnerable?
It will. It will make all health systems, including the NHS, vulnerable. But the second thing you have to watch out for is not those who are directly infected, but those who are actually displaced by the infected. So the elective procedures, all your chemotherapies, all your waiting times are going to be lengthened because you need to deal with this imminent emergency.
Do you think, realistically, I mean, you know the stats, are we going to be able to look after everyone, or are going to be some, when I say casualties, some people are definitely going to be way down the queue in order to deal with this?
Yeah, if you have a major outbreak, you have to take really, really difficult decisions, and that's what government is about. But if I go back to the 4 points that you said at the top of the programme, contain, well, what's the alternative? Not to contain. It seems like the right strategy to me. The second one, the delay parts, I don't think Matt didn't explain that in House today, didn't get a chance to, but delay is about making sure that we can get through this winter period so the NHS doesn't have the pressure that it has on it, because we are in the middle of winter pressures at the moment, because at the moment if we have to cancel routine operations, we've still got the winter pressures on top of us. That's what delay is about.
And very briefly, particularly for Scotland and rural areas.
Well, I think obviously rural areas may get a degree of protection from that, but equally they are going to be further from infrastructure. And I think that'll be a particular challenge for us. I mean, Scotland is 1/3 of the UK landmass. Trying to provide services, particularly if we reach a point of home testing or something like that, that will be an enormous challenge in Scotland.
Well, hold it there, we're going to come back to you. What is clear, though, is there is no unified global response to the coronavirus, no agreed United Nations position being followed. So there's been precious little information from Iran, where the Deputy Health Minister and an MP are among the 95 reported to have the virus, and where 15 people are reported dead, though tonight Tehran has announced some domestic travel restrictions. While on the other hand, as Professor Leung was saying, China has quarantined cities wholesale. Well, the former Secretary-General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, had to deal with H1N1 virus when he was in post. Gabriel Gatehouse spoke to him today and has this report.
This is not yet a global pandemic. For now, the WHO talks about epidemics in different parts of the world. China is the epicenter with more than 78,000 cases and more than 2,500 deaths. In Wuhan, the local authorities were initially slow to respond, losing vital time in containing the virus. But when China did take action, it was with a thoroughness that perhaps only the centralized power of Beijing could muster, locking down whole cities, confining tens of millions of people to their homes. Draconian, yes, but many believe that action was crucial to slowing the spread of the virus. But spread it has. Outside China, the largest number of cases have been reported in South Korea. Over 1,000 registered there, with 11 confirmed deaths. The outbreak has centred on the city of Daegu, with more than half of those affected linked to a religious sect whose secretive nature may have helped the virus spread undetected. The government in Seoul has raised the threat level, giving itself the power in principle to lock down cities and bar visitors from China. But interestingly, it hasn't yet done so. Instead, it's stepped up testing and is urging people to stay home voluntarily. In Iran, the government has been criticised for a lack of restrictions, and as a minister appeared in public suffering symptoms of the virus for perhaps not being as open as it might be. The outbreak has centred on the holy city of Qom. Qom attracts millions of pilgrims every year, and the shrines remain open amid fears that the virus is already spreading to other countries in the region. In Europe, the most significant outbreak is centred on northern Italy. There, the authorities have reported 11 deaths among more than 300 cases, and they're taking a mixed approach. A number of towns have been placed in quarantine, with around 50,000 people effectively locked in. Big public events like the Venice Carnival have been curtailed, public spaces cordoned off, and many schools, universities and museums are closed. But the authorities in Italy and neighbouring European countries have for now decided against closing borders. Ban Ki-moon was Secretary-General of the United Nations during the last global pandemic, the H1N1 flu outbreak a decade ago. I asked him how concerned he was about COVID-19.
I'm very much concerned about the speed of spreading of this coronavirus. Now, there is no such country unaffected. Even European countries have been now affected. Therefore, there must be a strong international cooperation. The sheer number of infected people and the nature of not respecting the boundaries have overwhelmed the people and the WHO in addressing this issue.
The WHO has praised the Chinese response to this, and they've basically put millions of people in lockdown. Is that the only way to respond to this? And do you think European countries, democratic countries, can do the same thing?
I think the locking down doesn't make much sense at this time because the virus does not care about the fixed administrative boundaries.
The measures they're taking in northern Italy, for example, where they've cordoned off whole cities, you think that's the wrong approach?
You cannot just control all this movement of people. Then without the locking down, it may not be as effective as one may think. The best way is to let the people know that they have to take themselves a very careful behaviors and in their movement. At the same time, fully cooperate with the governmental as well as international communities' support.
Ban Ki-moon talking to Gabriel Gatehouse. Well, our global health correspondent, Tulip Mazumdar, is back. Tulip, on the question of probity and truthfulness, different information from different regimes, and information that is actually trustworthy and untrustworthy.
Yes, and that is key, again, to ensuring this doesn't become a pandemic, that it is an epidemic. What we're seeing is, the World Health Organization has urged all countries to be as open and honest as they can be, to share all the information, to share the science, to share the number of cases. The picture in Iran is extremely worrying because the picture is extremely unclear. There have been around 100 cases, I should say, around 19 deaths, and those numbers don't quite add up, because if you're looking at a death rate of about 1 to 2%, we would expect a lot more cases, and that is why there is a major concern, because we have seen cases being exported from Iran into other countries with weaker health systems, and that what global health officials are extremely concerned about.
Tulip, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's hear now from a citizen in Iran, Baharak. She spoke to Newsnight earlier about the conditions there.
There's a really huge panic here because we don't know what is the situation, and the lack of information is so high because the government says that there have been only 95 people infected and there have been 15 people died, but we hear from each other that 2 people have been dead in this hospital or on another hospital, and then the information does not match, and it makes us more fear because we cannot trust the statistics and the government's information. And also we have lack of instruments because when you go to the drugstore, you cannot find any kind of alcohol or mask or gloves or even any antibacterial liquids or anything else like that. They say that anything related to corona is not available. Even when we go outside, you can see that nobody go close to each other. When people pass each other, they try to have distance to each other because it's you cannot find people even in the street. It's they try not to come out and they try to isolate themselves.
The view from Tehran, one view from Tehran. Professor Lang, what do you make of what's happening around? There's clearly misinformation. Clearly people saying there's nothing we can do to help you with the coronavirus here. Some people are wearing masks, some people aren't, some are self-isolating. The authorities clearly either don't have a handle on it or don't want to tell us what's happening.
I think that this epidemic has shown us the parallel infodemic.
Yeah.
Lack of information, not very good communications, or quite frankly, outright fake news is making it doubly hard to control the outbreak. And population anxiety, fear, even panic is one of those things that you must get ahead of if you want to control the outbreak.
But the truth of it is that you can't get ahead of it if you're not getting the truth from people. We're talking about fake news. Yes. Iran doesn't necessarily want to show weakness. Iran doesn't know how to deal with it. Iran doesn't have the capability to deal with it. So what does it do? It says it's not a big outbreak.
Yes, and we know that it's more severe than that because we're not only this discrepancy, but we're actually also seeing multiple cases cropping up in neighbouring countries that almost certainly come back to Iran. In Israel, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, there are cases that now can be traced back to Iran. And the big problem with the Middle East is that there are plenty of places where there are armed conflicts and going. And trying to control a disease in an area where, during an active war, is almost impossible.
Already presumably a refugee crisis as well. Is there more, do you think, that the Foreign Office can be doing, as it were, to bring countries in during this kind of time, as opposed to having, as it were, a standoff, which is what we have with Iran?
Well, we talked about an international response tonight, haven't we? But it's very difficult when you've got sketchy information. You've got countries saying nothing to see here because they fear the impact on them, and that's really, really difficult for us to do that. I don't know how you get around that. And let's be honest here. One of the reasons why this broke out where it did is because China tried to bury this, and the doctor who first raised this, well, we know, let's not rake all over that. But
well, I mean, the doctor who raised it died.
Exactly, yeah.
Was arrested
but
first.
He was not listened to, was he?
No.
He was arrested first. But I was just thinking today, when the Tedros, who leads the WHO, said, that an outbreak like this is your worst enemy. He said it's worse than terrorism in many regards, and he's right. But
because in fact we are incapable, or we have no agency of how to deal with something that's far away at the moment but coming to our door daily.
Well, I think also, the issue of a discrepancy between the fatalities and the number of cases. It was originally reported an 18% fatality rate in Wuhan. But some of that is you're not diagnosing the mild cases initially. Whereas when you start to realize what you're dealing with and you start to get the denominator right, then it looks more as if you're talking about 2% fatality rate rather than 18. And that may be the case in Iran. They may simply not have the ability to recognise the cases. It may be the geography, it may be the politics,
it's a fine line between dissemination of information and the danger of panic. As Lewis was saying, the government and local authorities, by law, have to create the possibility that there will be deaths and there will have to be burial sites. That's what they have to do. But it's not to say that they are going to be mass graves in the end. So how do we get this right? How do we get the preparedness? How do we get how do we, as it were, have a world response that is not a panicked response?
Well, I suppose that is a reason for the World Health Organization, is to try to have...
You might say that they are on trial after Ebola, wouldn't you say?
They're on trial after Ebola, and before that, the pandemic, which many have acknowledged is milder than they first feared or thought. And then Ebola was a lot worse than first assessed. And I think this time you have to protect vulnerable groups. And these are older folks. And older folks are, one, more susceptible, several times more susceptible than younger people in getting it. And then once they've caught it, they are several times more likely to die from it.
I want to ask you a bit more about that. But right now, just to pick up a little earlier, the doctor who was not believed, then arrested, then died in China.
The young ophthalmologist.
Had China moved more quickly, had China accepted what was happening earlier, do you think we'd have a better grip on this?
Of course, every second, every day counts in any stuttering beginnings of an epidemic. But to be fair, this bug is particularly wily, particularly bad, and particularly intelligent. It spreads possibly during the incubation period. It spreads very quickly. It is quite infective, more infective than the 2009 pandemic flu. So we're dealing with a very, very clever bug. And of course, we lost a few weeks at the beginning. And now you see this being spread all over the world.
What do you make of that? You were shaking your head about China.
No, I was agreeing, actually. I think one of the big differences between this and SARS is that COVID-19 seems to be infectious very soon after the onset of symptoms, whereas SARS, it was about a week or so later.
So do you think the World Health Organization has developed, as it were, the right, as it were, treatment plan for the world on this? Because we talked about Ebola a minute ago, we talked about the pandemic before.
Yeah, I think the World Health Organization has done remarkably well so far in this outbreak. It's taken steps early. It was involved with China pretty much as soon as China went into public on this epidemic, and it has brought together scientists, to address key gaps in our knowledge so that hopefully we will be able to manage it as it goes down the line.
Domestically, we're talking about an exponential increase at the moment. Domestically, what has to happen over the next few weeks? Are we going to see more people being allowed to work from home? Are we going to see kids at school being trained in different behaviours? What's going to have to happen?
Well, I think, as I said, if you're talking about containment, you have to be ahead of it. And, you know, when we start to see it, and I think it is going to be difficult to not see more cases, we need to look at imaginative things. We have literally, as we were talking earlier, millions of people who get on a train, get on a tube and go and sit in an office on a computer. Why could they not be working at home without it being
we don't have long, but what should we do about employers who want people to turn up at work?
I said in the House today that I think employers have a responsibility, people have a personal responsibility. You know, you don't need necessarily to travel to a conference. You can do it through technology, but just because people are about to go to bed, don't have nightmares, let's just remember this is a very nasty, very infectious virus, but of the 7,000 people that have been tested in this country, 13 positive, 8 have already recovered from it. In many, many cases, it is a very mild virus that does pass through. Obviously, it doesn't react to antibiotics because it's a virus, but in many cases, it is a very mild condition, and I don't think we shouldn't blow it out of proportion and panic people.
I think one of the things that I raised in the House is obviously the issue of people being paid when they're off, because one of the dangers if people aren't being paid or people are in kind of insecure 0 hours, the danger is someone might be given an advice to self-isolate, but they simply can't afford it. And the Secretary of State came back very strongly saying employers must recognise self-isolation, even if you're asymptomatic, is on medical advice.
Thank you all very much indeed. That's all we have time for tonight. But before we go, Newsnight has had a great night at the Royal Television Society. Journalism Awards this evening. Scoop, an interview of the year for the Prince Andrew interview, presenter of the year for Emily, Daily News programme of the year. Thanks to all of you for watching us night after night. Emma's back tomorrow. Good night.